I heard on the radio this week a little bit of wisdom. I was listening to WNYC, one of my favorite places to tune in when I'm busy getting ready or cooling down from a run or something like that. There was a little clip of someone who was giving a bit of wisdom to graduates, a featured little story about what wisdom would you share with graduates. And this guy, who happens to be an Amazon employee working in a warehouse, shared this little snippet. Adversity introduces a man to himself. That was the bit of wisdom that this man reflected upon as he thought what it is that young people need to know as they embark in the world beyond their education or even as they go further into it. Adversity introduces a man to himself. Now, I want to make a confession to our young people here in Ridgefield on behalf of the adults of Ridgefield. In many ways, we have attempted to protect you from adversity. It is something that's born out of the best intentions, the desire to create a life that is comfortable and joyful and happy and free. And so often, it's tempting even for us adults to put bumpers around life in order that you don't feel the pain that comes with living. One thing that we have discovered is that there's an unintentional teaching as a result of this. Unfortunately, some have received the instruction that suffering is the result of failure, or some error that has happened, or even this idea that suffering can be avoided. It can't. To be human is to suffer, whether it be in the disappointments of dreams that don't come true, whether it be in the sorrow of efforts that don't come to fruition, or whether it just be because that's what happens. There is suffering in this world. And yet it is the suffering that reminds us, that helps us find who we are. We see in today's gospel, Jesus has compassion on the crowds, looking at them, these people who are following him. He sees how hapless they are, kind of lost, and he has compassion on them. This word compassion means to suffer with. When you break it down into its parts, compassion is to suffer with another. Jesus has compassion on the crowds. He suffers with the crowds that gather around him, and he suffers with humanity throughout his ministry and even his death on the cross. Jesus has compassion, and he demonstrates this, showing us that to have compassion is to be human. He models for us how to do the same thing. So we wonder why it is that we are being drawn into suffering when we follow Jesus. Why is it that Jesus says, "Come, follow me," and to follow him means to go into the suffering of the world? We might think of it as some martyr complex, but you see, in Jesus' invitation, suffering isn't for the sake of suffering. Suffering is so that suffering can be redeemed. Entering into suffering is so that suffering can be redeemed, and Jesus invites us to follow him into the suffering of the world. Because there are three things that suffering teaches us. One is that suffering teaches us that we have to rely on God through prayer. Undeniably, suffering takes us into realms of life that we never anticipated going into, and so we already feel ill-equipped for the circumstances at hand. And so we are drawn into prayer, to voicing our needs and longings to God and saying, "I can't do this without your help." Suffering brings us into a deeper relationship and reliance on God through prayer. The second thing that suffering does for us, it helps us to be better at loving. To love someone in their suffering. To love someone whose suffering reveals our own vulnerability. To love someone in their suffering even as we feel afraid. We get good at loving. Suffering helps us get better at loving. And the third thing is that suffering shows us that we can be transformed. As we enter into relationship with those who are suffering, unafraid, we open ourselves to relying upon God, and God transforms us, all of us, in the process. These three things God wants us to know. And so God draws us into suffering, invites us to follow him into that suffering. So how do we do it? We wonder, how do we enter into people's suffering so that they will receive our companionship in it? If you reflected for a moment, if you were to enter into someone's suffering, would they receive you or refuse your presence? Perhaps they would refuse it only if they didn't think that they could trust you with their suffering. You, most certainly, anyone who's listening to this, has had a moment where someone has asked you, how are you? Or how are things? And you know the deep answer. And yet you think, I can't tell them. They won't know what to do with it. I can't trust them with the suffering I'm going through. If you were in worship a couple of weeks ago, I shared with you a dream that I'd had the night before. And I want to reflect on that dream again. It was a dream that left me the morning after awaking with this heavy feeling in my stomach. I had to take a moment to remember what was real, to try to make sense. Was that dream, did it actually happen, or was that a dream? It was one of those kind of dreams. And it was so vivid because I was sitting with a person in this congregation, a man who had just tragically, suddenly lost his wife. And in this dream, I was sitting with him as he was coming to process what that meant. He was just sitting there in silence, but then would offer a sentence here or there as he came to terms with this reality. Things like, I don't know where the medical records are, or her birthday was next week and I ordered her present yesterday. I was going to buy her card today. That kind of reckoning with the reality that was in front of him. I was listening to him, and he had just gotten to the point kind of as exhausting these deep awarenesses, and we were beginning to turn attention to how he was going to tell their children. And in my dream, another parishioner came into the room, a wonderful person who is a caring individual. And I said to this person, as she came into the room, I said, so-and-so's wife just died tragically. And this person said, oh, I just came in for the stapler. That was her reaction. And I was flabbergasted, the magnitude of this man's suffering, and she couldn't distract herself. She couldn't change her sense of direction than from coming in for the stapler. A moment later, another woman came in, and she too was a very caring individual, and I said to her, this man just lost his wife tragically, and she did a little chuckle laugh thing. She didn't know what to do either. It was grievous to feel this man's pain become multiplied as he became isolated in it. We are at a time in our country where suffering is very evident. It's in the news on all platforms. We hear it in various ways. I don't need to inform you of this. It is centered around racism and its inherent place in our society. The suffering is huge. We are at a time in our country where white people must enter into the suffering of Black Americans, because then they're not alone. But how do we do this? Every white person has work to do on this. There is no white person, not a one, who has graduated from learning about the suffering that we now see. There is not one of us that can consider ourselves educated enough and our understanding complete. I emphasize this so emphatically because I want us to hear the daily invitation from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ to enter into the suffering that we witness, to not be afraid. As followers of Jesus, to go into the suffering that we see. We do this by becoming educated, by listening. There are so many resources out there that can help instruct and inform us. We don't need our Black friends to give us a private lesson. All of it is right there for our instruction. As followers of Jesus, we enter into the suffering around us with Christ, which means that we will be transformed, all of us together. Power structures will be altered so that God's love liberates the oppressed. You hear that in our hymn this morning, in our gradual hymn, this second stanza. Holy and redemptive Spirit, liberating power. When your children were in bondage, in their darkest hour, you guided them and released them beyond the parted sea. Break now the chains that fetter us, set every people free. This stanza of this hymn is referring to the Exodus, a powerful story of God's love liberating his people. He could bear their sorrow no more. He demanded justice for his people, and he did it through getting Pharaoh to let go. Moses, the prophet, communicated to Pharaoh over and over again the need to let God's people go. And we see in the plagues, all 10 of them, Pharaoh saying yes and then saying no, saying yes and then saying no. Ultimately, the last plague is the death of the firstborn, not only of humans, the Egyptians' children, not only the firstborn there, but of all animals. The Egyptians are so distracted by their grief and the agony in front of them that the Hebrew people have time to escape and to flee. But do you know the story well enough to remember that later Pharaoh, realizing that the Hebrew people are gone, rallies his army and pursues them still? The Hebrew people are brought through the Red Sea. They make it across just in time before the Egyptian army comes on their heels, and it is God who claims for them victory. And Egyptian lives are lost. They drown in the Red Sea. This is the story of our faith. It's the story that the disciples knew. It's the story that Jesus knew, and he came to fulfill, to complete. Let my people go, Jesus says. And he still says it now. In our gospel lesson today, Jesus is coaching his disciples in the way of nonviolence. He is telling them, I am sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. You have to be wise and innocent. Undeniably, he knows that the disciples will witness God's power in their midst, this transforming power that will transform structures, and there will be those in power that will not welcome it. He tells them to keep focused on this way of love that he's instructed them in. And he tells them, even in their persecution, to hold fast and to endure, because love will end up winning in the end. Love will triumph, this way of love. Does that ring a bell to you, the way of love? Does that echo in your head? Our own church, the Episcopal Church, has been working on the way of love, inviting us into the way of love, fortifying ourselves, instructing ourselves through Scripture, through our practices of what that actually means. King's principles of nonviolence return us to that again. I pulled them up yet again. I have our copy from home. It's got some food stains because every now and then we read it at the table. 6 principles of nonviolence. These were published in King's first book, Stride Toward Freedom. I'll just go through them quickly here. Principle 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. It is active nonviolent resistance to evil. It is aggressive spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. Number 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation. The purpose of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. Number 3, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. Nonviolence recognizes that evildoers are also victims and are not evil people. The nonviolent resistor seeks to defeat evil, not people. Principle 4, nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. Suffering. Nonviolence accepts suffering without retaliation. Unearned suffering is redemptive and has tremendous educational and transforming possibilities. Principle 5, nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. Nonviolence resists violence in the spirit as well as the body. Nonviolent love is spontaneous, unmotivated, unselfish, and creative. Spontaneous. And principle 6, nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. The nonviolent resistor has deep faith that justice will eventually win. Nonviolence believes that God is a God of justice. Yes, as we saw in the Exodus, justice is a dimension of love. When we look at King's principles, we can also recall the commitment card that was created in 1963 for anyone who participated in a rally. This is so profound in its instruction because it reminds us of what the anticipated experience would be. There are 10 things to remember. Meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Remember always that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. Follow the directions of the movement and of the captain on a demonstration. It goes on to ask for a sign of this pledge, having seriously considered what I do and with the determination and will to persevere. Your signature, address, phone, nearest relative, and their address. Folks were to put this card in their pockets as they participated in rallies. What does this remind us of? What it reminds me of is it's hard. It's hard to be a part of the way of love. It's hard to be a follower of Jesus. It's hard to practice nonviolence. But this invitation of Jesus is for a life of redemption, for all creation. It's the way that salvation happens, and that's why Jesus instructs his disciples and invites us into the same. Adversity introduces a man to himself, that Amazon worker reminded everyone. But that's what Paul reminds us of too in his letter to the Romans. Suffering produces endurance. We learn to find our strength for the long haul, and how do we find it? We find it in God. Endurance produces character. As we find our strength in God, we then remember who we are, children of God, fortified for the mission that God has called us into in the way of love. And character produces hope. When we remember ourselves as children of God, we then can find ourselves in the promises of God. And we can hope in God because God has already shown us in Jesus his faithfulness to creation to bring everyone into salvation. Hope does not disappoint us, Paul says, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. Indeed, my friends, the living God transforms the power structures of this world so that all creation might live. And we boast, therefore, in our suffering because we know that in our suffering with those who suffer, we will become more human together. It is in our humanity that we discover our divinity. It's in our humanity that we discover the power of God within us. It's in our humanity that we discover together that God transforms all of us together. God has demonstrated that he works through suffering to bring about life. And so the question to us is, can we trust God enough to enter into the suffering that we witness? God is compassionate. We see this through Scripture. We know this in our lives. God is compassionate and gently asks us to take the next step. God is so gentle in that invitation. It's up to us to say yes to that quiet whisper of an invite. Please, take the next step. Yes, Lord, I'll take the next step. No matter your age, whether you're just now leaving high school or you've completed some other level of formal education, whether you know what your career is or what you want it to be, or maybe you're already engaged in your life's work, or maybe you've retired from your vocation, no matter your age, the call on each of our lives is to grow as followers of Jesus, to enter into the suffering of the world so that transformation of that suffering can take place through Christ, through love. This, my friends, is the good news, because it means that we will be made new too. Amen.